For more, I am joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor at Newsweek. Batya, thanks so much for coming back to the U.S. Report. I want to start with this news here that the Biden administration has announced a national strategy to combat not anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia. Let's have a little listen to that announcement.
And so today, I am proud to announce the Biden-Harris administration will develop our nation's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia. This strategy will be a comprehensive and detailed plan to protect Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim from hate, bigotry, and violence.
Now, Batya, we can all agree that Islamophobia is a terrible thing, but all I'm seeing across my news here is attacks on Jewish Americans, people at schools, people out on the streets. How is this being received among Americans?
I think a lot of people chuckled at this because it seemed to be addressing the exact wrong problem. Of course, I totally agree with you. Hating Muslims, Islamophobia is horrible. The problem is I'm not sure that it really exists in the numbers that such attention would suggest. There was a horrific story of a young Muslim boy who was killed by a crazy person, for all intents and purposes, who was reading the news, but that was the only episode that I have seen. What we're seeing a lot of is anti-Semitic vandalism, anti-Semitic chanting, anti-Semitic attacks against American Jewish students on college campuses, and so a lot of people chuckled at this. Well, where's our thing? I do have to say, I don't know that many Jews are going to hold this against the Biden administration. A lot of people feel that Biden has shown a lot of support for Israel. President Obama recently released a statement that was so horrific, and just the contrast between what we could have had and President Biden's, the way that he has been supporting Israel, I think that meant a lot to a lot of American Jews. The other thing I've been seeing a lot of is people seem to feel that this is a very naked ploy to get votes. People feel that Muslim Americans are probably turned off by President Biden's approach to the Middle East conflict. And so this is an attempt to say, we see you, we hear you, and get those voters back. Although I have to say, James, I wouldn't be surprised if those Muslim voters had started to sort of leave the Democratic Party long before this happened. We know that 35% of Muslim Americans voted for Donald Trump. We know that Donald Trump has been rising in the polls specifically for voters of color, specifically for working class voters of color. And so I'm not totally convinced that they're leaving President Biden over his handling of this issue.
Well, this is a really interesting thing to me, Batya, because you mentioned Barack Obama, and he has been, shall we say, a fair bit more equivocal on Israel and their right to defend themselves than Joe Biden. Is this a generational split in the Democrat Party, where Joe Biden still represents, for all of his flaws, kind of that older Democratic Party that still had a real commitment to Israel before the sort of the modern version of the party, which is incredibly anti-Israel and much more focused on that kind of whole victim-oppressor Marxist narrative around the Palestinians?
James, in 2021, I would have said, you're right. There's a generational divide. The future looks grim for Jewish Americans, for people who care about Israel, who support Israel, who believe that Israel is an important ally for the United States in the Middle East. This time around, I have to say, I've really been very surprised by the wellspring of support for Israel that I've seen across the board. There is a tiny fringe, very, very heavily concentrated in the elites on the left at universities, in the media, and then also on TikTok, because of course TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and so they have been amplifying pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian content. That's where you're seeing this support. Everywhere else, there is just so much more support for Israel's right to defend itself, so much so that I saw a recent poll where when they asked Americans whose fault are the civilian casualties in Gaza, 63% said that they are Hamas's fault, and only 13% said that they are Israel's fault. So that really tells you something about the temperature of the nation.
Gee, that's good to hear, because I think in Australia the numbers might be a little, unfortunately, different. But I was really interested in what you said there, Batya, about the elites and elite institutions. And we're going to speak to some people involved with university campuses a bit later in the program. But Yale, the Yale Daily News newspaper, and of course Yale being this great Ivy League university that basically is a training ground for American elites, they took down an editorial or an article because they said that it made, quote, unsubstantiated claims that Hamas raped women and beheaded men, unquote. This just seems absolutely, well, insane to me that people would deny this evidence, especially when I'm sure they would have taken Hamas on their word that Israel bombed that hospital, which, of course, they didn't do.
Yeah, I believe that the article was left up, but it had an editor's note at the bottom, a correction, and then that correction was ultimately taken down. But you're absolutely right. Yale be clowning itself. Columbia, 300 professors coming out in support of Hamas. Harvard, the editor of the Harvard Law Review, literally attacking a Jewish student, screaming at them and pushing them, right? Stanford University coming out in support of Hamas. These are institutions of elite higher learning. They are where elites reproduce their elite status. And that is really the point here, James. These institutions are no longer institutions of education. They are institutions of elite reproduction.
Indeed.
And how do you show the world that you are part of the elites? You have to distinguish yourselves from the middle class, from the bourgeois, from the working class, from those values that good-hearted, regular, normal people have. For example, the idea that, oh, I don't know, mass rape is bad. Setting babies on fire is bad. These are ideas that every good-hearted person, every person knows to be true. And so at these institutions of elite status production, they have to show that they aren't just part of the normies, that they are separate and different and better than them. And so they have to turn against this idea that terrorism is bad. That's
Crazy.
What you're seeing at these elite universities. Yeah.
Crazy stuff, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Thank you so much, and look forward to having you back again soon on the U.S. Report.
Thanks, James.